thing we didn't talk about yet, his name, Holden Caulfield. Holden, it's suggesting, to me anyway, and I could be wrong, what's he holding on to? His innocence? His sanity? His sister Phoebe? His brother Allie? What is he holding to? Did Salinger intend Holden to suggest holding? Is it another example of what we said before? Parapraxis or a Freudian slip? It's just a cool name? Again, you'd have to do a lot of research on J.D. Salinger to find the answer to those questions, but it might be something worth looking into if it is in fact interesting to you and you'd like to write about it. In Chapter 2, Holden decides to go visit his old teacher, Mr. Spencer, as he calls him, Old Spencer. Now, like a lot of kids, Holden thinks adults are not just older, but old. In Spencer's case, though, he seems to be right. He describes Spencer as being very old, and that raises a question for Holden. I mean, I used to think about old Spencer quite a lot, and if you thought about him too much, you wondered, what the heck was he still living for? I mean, he was all stooped over, and he had very terrible posture, and in class, whenever he dropped a piece of chalk at the blackboard, some guy in the first row always had to get up and pick it up and hand it to him. That's awful, in my opinion. But why does Holden think it's awful? Is it old age in general that he thinks is awful? Is it Spencer in particular that he thinks is awful? Seems like Holden has a problem with growing up and facing the reality of age and death. That's something that causes Holden to be a little edgy. One of the things that is one of his problems is not wanting to accept that he has to grow up. I suppose if he could be like Peter Pan and stay a boy forever, he probably would. Except he's not really happy as a boy either. It's in this chapter that we really start to see how judgmental Holden is. He is young, he still feels very like he can pass judgment on people. He says about old Spencer, they got a bang out of things though, in a half-assed way, of course. And later he says, you take somebody old as hell like old Spencer, and they can get a big bang out of buying a blanket. That seems to be the trick that Holden is missing. Mr. and Mrs. Spencer seem old but content, whereas Holden is young and miserable. So why is it, what's the trick that allows somebody like Spencer to go on living even though he's old and decrepit, and yet Holden, who's young and relatively healthy except for his terrible smoking habit, is miserable all the time and can find joy in absolutely nothing. Miserable. The question in this chapter gets pushed a little farther when down below he says, what made it even more depressing, old Spencer had on this very sad, ratty old bathrobe. He was probably born in or something. Does that go back to the question earlier that Pensy underpays its teachers even though it's a wealthy school for wealthy kids? Or does that speak to Mr. Spencer's ability to hold on to things that are important in a way that Holden can't? See, by having that really ratty old bathrobe, it is possible that Spencer can find an appreciation in a half-assed way about something like a bathrobe and care about it and like it, whereas Holden has a hard time holding on to stuff, getting attached to stuff, probably because he fears of losing it. I mean, he had a nice coat, and those guys at Pensy Prep stole it. His fear of loss may be preventing him from getting too attached to things. All the stuff I'm telling you are ideas that you should explore through your own reading and doing your own research so that you can come up with ideas to write about. One of the things that everybody has to do when they read books like this in school is they have to write about them. And in order to write about a book, you have to have something to say. And it's important that you come up with your own questions and you explore those questions and you research those questions so that you can write down and prove, using evidence from the book, good answers to those questions. That's kind of the point. Another way that this chapter poses some questions or serves as a kind of meditation on aging is when Holden talks about his own age and the way that people perceive his age. I have gray hair, I really do. The one side of my head, the right side, is full of millions of gray hairs, and I've had them ever since I was a kid, and yet I still act sometimes like I was only about 12. Everybody says that, especially my father. It's partly true, but it isn't all true. People always think something's all true. I don't give a damn, except that I get bored sometimes when people tell me to act my age. Sometimes I act a lot older than I am. I really do, but people never notice it. People never notice anything. That's an important line. That bothers Holden a lot. There's little details about individuals that Holden thinks he notices, but that he thinks no one else notices about those people. And that's going to become important as we go further into the story. Eventually, we find that Spencer was Holden's history teacher. Holden says that Spencer was mad about history. Another time this word mad comes up. Remember, there was Mad Anthony Wayne. That's not listed in the story, but if you do some research, you'll learn that Anthony Wayne Avenue, where Spencer lives, is a guy from history who was mad. That's not angry. That's, crazy. Anyway, and of course, Holden with his madman antics that he's been writing about. Holden says he can't really get that worked up about history. He's not that interested in history. History is interesting because we're all shaped by it every day, in the sense that our civilization is, and we live where we live because of history. We speak the languages we speak because of history, and we have the inventions that we have because of history, and all that kind of stuff. But on the other hand, your individual life, on a day-to-day basis, doesn't really seem to be affected by history. Not when you wake up in the morning and brush your teeth and go to school. That does not seem to either have historical significance, or for most people, most of the time, be impacted by historical significance. That's how Holden sees it. Holden gets really mad when Mr. Spencer reads Holden's own paper back to him. It was a terrible paper. Holden knows it was a terrible paper, which is why he gets mad and feels actually betrayed that Spencer reads it to him. He says, in fact, he would have never read a paper like that to Spencer. But of course, Spencer's just trying to show Holden how poorly he was doing. Try to maybe give Holden a little wake-up call, a little tough love. But Holden doesn't want to hear it. He already knows he's doing badly. He understands that he's a terrible student. That's why he's leaving Pensy Prep in the first place, because he's not doing well there. Feels like it's a little bit of like adding insult to injury when Spencer emphasizes how poorly Holden had written a paper that he already knew he wrote poorly. The other interesting thing we get in this chapter is we get Holden starting to talk about his personal war on phonies, how much he hates phonies, and his experiences with past phonies, and how much he doesn't like them. But we also find that Holden himself is with these planes. You don't really notice the level of noise pollution until you're trying to make a video outdoors. Holden is talking to Spencer about this and that, but the whole time he's talking to Spencer, his mind is wandering and he's thinking about the ducks that live in the lagoon at Central Park. This is an important image that comes up a lot throughout the rest of the story, so pay attention to it. But it shows that Holden is himself phony. He pretends to be carrying on a conversation. In fact, he got mad earlier in the chapter that Spencer doesn't really listen to him when Holden speaks. But here's Holden also not listening to Spencer when he speaks, which shows that Holden sometimes lacks self-awareness. That's one of his big character flaws. He thinks he has these great insights into other people, and in many ways he does, but he can't see himself at all. Also in this chapter, Holden talks about Mr. Thurmer, the headmaster of the school, who Holden hates for being a phony. Holden tells Spencer that Thurmer's advice was, life's a game, and you got to play by the rules. Now we know how Holden regards games, right? He was not at all interested in the football game that the whole school had turned out to watch. He himself was standing alone on a hill, aloof, above, apart from that game. Also, the fencing match, first of all, he wasn't a fencer. He wasn't in the competition himself. He was supposed to be the manager, which when you think about it is someone who stands back and sort of runs things. Even that, Holden did badly because he left the entire bag of fencing equipment on the train. Did he do that accidentally? Was it a Freudian slip because he hated the guys on the team, or he was trying to sabotage his own success? Again, these are arguments that you could make in your writing by finding evidence in the story to support those kinds of theories. Holden says, game my ass. Some game. If you get on the side where all the hot shots are, then it's a game, all right, I'll admit that. But if you get on the other side where they're earning the hot shots, then what's a game about it? Nothing. No game. So Holden rejects the idea that life is a kind of a game. And that's part of the problem. In many ways, the old guys are right. I mean, there is a certain game to life. I mean, there are certain rules or things we can and can't do in this world. Not that we can't do them, but if we do them, there are consequences. Just like if you do commit a foul in basketball, there are consequences. That aspect of life, Holden has a really hard time accepting. But, to quote Frank Sinatra, that's life. Holden in this chapter says that he and Spencer are too much on opposite sides of the pole. They are, in almost every sense of the word. Holden is young, and kind of unstable and, doesn't know anything about love or relationships. Spencer's old, career he's almost done with his whole career. He's been in a long-term relationship with his wife for many years. They really are on opposite sides of the pole. But it's Holden, not Spencer, who has a hard time bridging that gap and making that connection. Holden accuses, in his mind, Spencer of not being a good listener. But the whole time Spencer's talking to him, Holden's tuning him out and is focused on things like where do the ducks go in Central Park, on Spencer himself, and how old and gross he looks in his room, all sick with his pale chest sticking out and his gross legs. The description does make it sound pretty gross, but it's not phony. Holden, since he hates phonies, should like the gritty reality, even the ugly bits, but he doesn't like it. He finds it depressing. This is sort of an internal conflict going on with Holden that a smart reader will pay attention to, and a smart student is going to look at as topics for writing. One of the great ironies in this chapter is Holden, who's really a mess, is feeling sorry for Spencer, who really seems to have gotten his act together. Holden may not like the life that Spencer has created for himself, but he created a life for himself, whereas Holden, so far, is really struggling with the simple task of living in this world. We'll get to the next part of the story soon. Until then, salud.